Welcome to Business Ethics. The first portion of this lecture will cover ethics and business. By the end of this, you should be able to analyze the basic nature of business ethics, emphasize the importance of morale reasoning and morale decision-making in business ethics, examine ethical issues arising from globalization and international business connections and practices, as well as explain the deep foundations and structure of morale reasoning, and to assess the factors that define and refine the concept of moral responsibility. Now, quick introduction for you. What is business ethics? Business ethics is the application of ethics to those institutions and activities we call business. What is the general process for preparing a discussion of business ethics? Well, it provides a framework, a good framework, a basic principles for understanding what is meant by the term good and right, and different discussions of methods of moral reasoning and some fundamental moral principles as well. Let's take it a step further, the nature of business ethics. Well, we'll look at the first point where we discuss what are the definitions and meanings of ethics. Well, ethics studies the principles of conduct that govern individuals or groups. Ethics consists of the rule by which individuals live their personal lives. Ethics is the study of morality. What do we do when we study ethics? We investigate morality and examine the results of that investigation. And let's talk about what is the Merck & Co. Inc. river blindness issue. Well, Merck is a U.S. pharmaceutical company. River blindness is the name of a parasitic disease that causes blindness and intense physical and psychological discomfort. It is an endemic in 30 African countries, 6 Latin American countries, as well as Yemen. It's passed from person to person by a fly's bite that passes a tiny worm that burrows under the skin. Merck scientists thought that they discovered that one of their animal drugs, ivermectin, might kill the parasite. The question for Merck was whether to develop and test a drug that few in the affected areas could afford to buy. The company decided to go forward because of the potential human benefits were great. Mexizin was the result. A once-year pill that would eradicate the parasite and prevent new infections. No one, not the World Health Organization or any government, would buy the pill. Merck eventually decided to give the pill away, 2.5 billion tablets by 2015. Now let's clarify the ethical issue here. Why is ethical behavior a good long-term strategy for business? Ethical behavior can give a company significant competitive advantages over companies that are not ethical. If ethical behavior is the best choice for businesses, why don't they all act accordingly? Well, not everyone thinks it is in their best interest to act ethically. It's not always clear what the ethical course of action is. Some people don't know how to make sense of their ethical choices. What is morality? It is, as distinguished from the discipline known as ethics, morality is the set of standards an individual or group has about what is right and wrong, or good and evil. Who is B.F. Goodrich? Well, vehicle parts manufacturer that won a military contract to design, test, and manufacture aircraft brakes for the U.S. Air Force A-7D aircraft. What error did they make? Well, it promised that the Air Force would deliver brakes to certain specs, that the brakes would be delivered on time, and that the brakes would pass the required tests. A series of decisions based on promises induced the company to produce brakes that were not reliable, despite warnings from at least one of the engineers who developed the brakes. Now, what moral standards were reflected in this employees interviewed about the case? Well, one believed that as an engineer, he had an obligation to do your best, no matter what it costs. Another believed that it was wrong to lie and to endanger the lives of others. And he also believed that the integrity is good and dishonesty is bad. Now let's talk about moral standards. Moral standards are the norms we have about the kinds of action we believe are morally right and wrong. Moral standards, what we believe to be morally good or bad. And the moral norms can usually be expressed as a general rules about our actions. So, where do moral standards come from? Well, as children, we learn our moral standards from family, friends, and various societal influences such as the church, school, television, magazines, music, and associations as well. As we mature, our life experience and intellectual development may lead us to evaluate and perhaps revise these standards. So, what are examples of non moral norms? Well, standards of etiquette by which we judge people's manners are good or bad, the rules of behavior set by parents, teachers, or other authorities, the norms we call the law by which we determine what is legally right and wrong, the standards of language by which we judge what is grammatically right or wrong, the standard of art by which we judge whether a painting or a song is good or bad, the sports standard by which we judge how well a game of football or basketball is played. So, how do we distinguish between moral and non moral standards? Well, studies show an innate ability to distinguish moral from non moral norms. These are the 6 characteristics of moral standards. Number one, moral standards deal with serious matters. Number two, moral standards are preferred to other values. Number three, moral standards are independent of authority. Number four, moral standards are universal. Number five, moral standards are determined impartially. And number six, moral standards are associated with special emotions and vocabulary. Now, for more reasoning and moral decision making, we have these 6 characteristics as I listed to you. We see it covers serious matters, pertains to other values, universal, impartial, emotions, and so forth. The list is there for you. This table is the moral versus non-moral norms that we see. Group one, it has do not harm other people. Group two is do not eat with your mouth open. Do not steal what belongs to you. Do not chew gum in class. Do not lie to people. Do not wear socks that do not match. So this is the moral versus non-moral norms. This is some things that we see people speak of, but is it really morality? No. Moral. What do ethical standards require? Good reasons for holding them. What other disciplines study ethics? We talk about anthropology, sociology, psychology. How do other disciplines study of morality differ from that enlisted by ethics? Well, these disciplines approach morality descriptively. A descriptive study attempts to explain the world as it is, not as it ought to be. Ethics approaches the study of morality prospectively, and as such, it can be a normative study. A normative study aims to reach conclusions about things that are good or bad and ought to have actions are right or wrong. So, as such, it aims to discover what ought to be. Now, what does business ethics study? Well, business ethics studies moral standards and how you actually apply to them. Modern social systems and organizations through which modern societies produce and distribute goods and services, and activities of people who work within these particular organizations. Now, let's talk about the myriad issues that arise in business ethics to be organized. We have systematic issues, corporate issues, as well as individual issues. So, how can we apply to businesses the moral standards that apply to individuals? In other words, how can business actions be moral or immoral? If individuals are the only moral agent, how can businesses be morally responsible? One view is that companies do act as moral agents. A moral agent is an individual who acts intentionally. An agent that can have rights and moral responsibilities is a moral agent. Since corporations engage in intentional actions, they can be moral agents. And we have objections. So companies don't seem to act or act intentionally the way people do. Moreover, they do not have minds, they do not feel pleasure or pain. Another issue is that companies act like machines. They are not, therefore, morally responsible for what they do. The objection here is that companies, unlike machines, consist of human beings who do not intentionally and are moral agents as well. Here we look at the moral categories. They are designed for people and they involve different reasons, feelings, deliberations, and corporations, they don't have these per se. Now, insofar as companies are constituted by people, people are moral agents as well, and that legal fiction of corporate personhood allows the law to treat corporations in many ways as they do individuals, both in the terms of rights and responsibilities. Corporations are at least morally responsible in a secondary or derivative sense, in the sense that their moral duties are derived from individuals who make up the company. Now, what are the arguments against applying ethical standards to business? A free market economy ensures the maximum social benefit, so business ethics is not required. Company employees, particularly managers, are obliged to be loyal to the company, not ethics. So business ethics has no place in business. Ethics only requires a company's obedience to the law. So long as company follows the law, business ethics is not needed. What are the erroneous assumptions in these arguments? Well, one, most industrial markets are not perfectly competitive. Businesses that don't have to compete can maximize profits despite inefficient production. Two, steps taken to increase profits won't necessarily be socially beneficial. They may instead harm society. Number three, producing what society wants suffices enough as the production of what society values. People, however, value different things. And a moral standard that managers should pursue their firm's interests. This is a standard that not everyone accepts and that it is normative, which shows that ethics does matter in business. In the case for ethics in business, what is the case for business ethics? Well, a business can't collapse if its employees have unethical aspects. So some business ethics are required for a business to remain viable. A stable society is required for firms to conduct business, and stable society requires ethics as well. So it is in business best interest to promote business ethics. Now, what is corporate social responsibility? It is the corporation's responsibility for obligations for society. What are some views of the CRS? Well, some argue that there is no CRS, that no obligation to do anything except maximize shareholders or stockholders' profits. That is the shareholder view. And based on Milton Friedman's theory, objections to the Friedman view include the criticism that one, shareholders are employees to whom the employees were obligated to. And legally, the corporation is the employer. So shareholders are not the owners of the company, only the owners of the stock. Executives are not obligated to run the company the way shareholders want to be run. So the stakeholder theory presented by Edward Freeman and David Reed asserts that a stakeholder is any identifiable group or individual who can affect the achievement of an organization's objective or who is affected by achievement of an organization's objective as well. As such, stakeholders can harm, benefit, or influence a company. So this theory asserts that a company should be run for the benefit of a business's stakeholders. There's two main types of arguments in support of the stakeholder theory. We look at instrumental arguments, where focus on the best interests of the corporation, which include being responsive to stakeholders. That normative argument that corporations have obligations to be responsive to all stakeholders. The overriding concept here is fairness. And then what is the distinction between business ethics and the CRS? So the CRS is larger concept into which business ethic fits. So at the same time, business ethics serves as a justification for the CSR. Now let's step into ethical issues in international business. What are the types of technology related to new technologies? So we have information technology, nanotechnology, as well as biotechnology. What's the main issue in new technologies? Risk in new technologies, predictability of risk, the cost-benefit analysis of potential risks, and the knowledge of and consent to risks. What is globalization? The connection between and among nations that allows for goods, services, capital, knowledge, and cultural artifacts move to across national borders at an increasing rate. In technology and business ethics, we talk about what is technology, those methods, processes, and tools that humans invent to manipulate and control their environment. So how do technological advances introduce new ethical issues? We talk about free trade, just pricing, opportunities for deception, for instance, stock price manipulation, and then labor exploitation, environmental impact. What are the ethical issues in information technology? So privacy and big data, given the vast amounts of information that can be collected, there are concerns that private information is jeopardized. Property rights and information for computer programming can be copied many times over, which leads to questions of extent of ownership of that copy. And then we have environmental concerns that nanotechnology, it is unclear how negative the impact on the environment could actually be. We have carbon nanotubes, for example, that cause cancer in rats who inhale them. The biotechnology and genetic engineering, whether or not to the extent it is ethical to manipulate nature, are the four of the ethicals of biotechnology. Now, another step further for globalization and business ethics, what are the advantages, disadvantages with globalization? Well, some advantages include the multinational corporations have brought jobs and skills to developing countries, thereby elevating the standard of living in these places. So corporations have specialized in producing these goods that can be produced more efficiently and trade for what they do not make. And some disadvantages are that the accusations that have been leveled against the corporation for significant harms against people and the environment. For instance, destruction of local cultures and environmental waste. Globalization allows for that mobilization that can create unfair demands on host countries. So developing nations cannot cope with the risks of new technologies. Now, what sorts of ethical problems are created by globalization? We look at managers of corporations operating in foreign countries that do not always understand. For instance, local cultures, financial markets, laws, and governmental processes. Should the managers follow these or their home countries? The main ethical problem becomes one of relativism. Now, what is ethical relativism? Now, the view that the morality is relative to groups, cultures, or nations, there are no independent, objective, and moral truths. So the criticisms include the argument that relativism is only superficial, similar, more fundamental moral beliefs shared by people around the world, differences in beliefs that do not entail the claim that there's no moral truths. Relativism leads to incoherent consequences, such as being committed to avoiding criticism practices such as slavery. Relativism privileges the moral standards widely accepted in a given society, but this does not imply that they cannot be criticized. Now, let's look at the integrative social contracts theory. What is it? It provides a way to understand how to deal with moral differences. What are hypernorms and microsocial norms? Well, hypernorms are part of social contract, are standards that should be applied to all people in every society. Microsocial, consent of community, norms differ from society to society. They are those norms accepted by society. The ISCT asserts that the hypernorms take precedence over microsocial norms. The deep foundations and structures of moral reasoning. What are the key goals of this section? Well, we should look over the exam moral standards, examine the reasoning process by which standards are applied to issues, to describe development of one's ability to use and critically evaluate moral standards, to describe some of the reasoning processes through which these moral standards are evaluated and used, and to describe some of the ways that they can go wrong. In regards to moral development, what are Kohlberg's 6 stages of moral development? We look at the pre-conventional orientations, the punishment and obedience. Morality involves obedience to authority figures, either to avoid pain or to receive praise. The instrumental and relative, one satisfies others' desires in order to get what one wants. Conventional orientation, that interpersonal coordinates, being that morality involves living up to the expectation of those to whom one feels loyal, for instance, family members. Law and order, morality involves loyalty to one's society. And the post-conventional orientation, the social contract, moral norms are relative, but consensus is achievable. So that universal moral principles chosen because of their reasonableness. Now, feminists and care ethics, critics of Kohlberg's view. Women value caring and responsibility. Women view moral development in terms of progress toward better ways of caring and being responsible. Women's moral stages consist of the conventional stage of caring only for oneself, for conventional stage of caring for others to the neglect of oneself, and the post-conventional stage of achieving a balance between caring for others and caring for oneself as well. So what is the role of emotions in moral decisions? Logic and reasoning are significant elements of ethics, but our emotions are also involved in moral reasoning. So empathy, sympathy, and so forth are significant touchstones for our ethical deliberations. The structure of moral reasoning. What is the structure of moral reasoning? Well, moral reasoning must be logical. It's understanding moral standards and their general applications. We look at factual evidence cited must be accurate, relevant, and complete as well. The evidence of information that a particular person, policy, institution, or behavior exhibits or fails to exhibit moral standards. And the moral standards must be consistent. So a conclusion or moral judgment that the person, policy, institution, or behavior is prohibited or required, right or wrong, just or unjust, valuable or condemnable, and so on. Now, let's take it a step further with the structure of moral reasoning. We look at the different steps to ethical behavior. So what are the steps to ethical behavior? One, we look at the awareness of ethical issue or situation as well. We look at judgment about the ethical course of action, the decision to do or not do what is judged is right, to act on the intention or decision of what we have. So we have awareness, judgment, decision, and action as well, okay? Those being our prime ones. Now, the questions to consider throughout this process, well, will one or more persons be harmed? How much harm have or will be inflicted? How likely is it that the harm will occur? How close is the harm? Has the harm occurred or will it occur? Does the harm violate moral standards acceptable to most people? So what are some forms of moral disengagement that falsely reduce the moral problem? Well, we look at the euphemistic labeling, rationalizing our actions, so downsizing rather than firing, diminishing comparisons, comparing current situations to a much larger problem, displacement and responsibility. I was just following the orders. The diffusion of responsibility, I was one of many. Disregarding or distorting the harm, denial of evidence, dehumaning the victim, that non-human label, redirecting blame, adversing or circumstances are responsible. So how do we judge what is ethical course of action is? You want to avoid these three forms of bias theories: the world, others, and self. How do we decide what to do, what's right? The ethical climate of organization, we look at the expectations for behavior. The ethical culture of organization encourage and discourage behavior. How do we act on our decision? The ego strength, the strength of will, this loss of control, believing that what happens is under one's control, and response to authority, one's strength of respect for authority as well. Now, the foundations of moral reasoning, we look at judging the ethical course of action. To avoid these forms of base theories, we look at organization as well. Judging the ethical course of action often depends on the ethical climate of the organization and the ethical culture of the organization. Acting on a decision depends on ego strength, loss of control, response to authority. Here are the 4 steps leading to ethical behavior: recognizing, judging, deciding, and carrying out. Now, moral responsibility and blame. We look at why is it important to be clear about what is involved in the moral reasoning. Well, responsibility for amends. Accuracy is identifying responsible parties or different parties. Responsibility account for appropriate feelings. Accountability for one's actions. When is a person morally responsible? What are the criteria for moral responsibility for injuries or wrongs? Well, once caused, you want to help cause, or it could have prevented a harm. The individual knew what he or she was doing. The individual willingly committed the act. Taking it a step further, we look at negating factors that reduce one's moral responsibility for an action, circumstances that reduce involvement, circumstances that affect knowledge of what one is doing, circumstances that interfere with one's free will to act or refrain from acting, such as coercion or threat, and the extent of wrong. We also look at what are the essential points of moral responsibility and elimination of moral responsibility. We look at causation, knowledge, freedom. How is moral responsibility negated? Minimal contribution to the act, uncertainty, coercion or threat, and that seriousness of the wrong. And then our final wrap up of this portion being that responsibility of corporate actions. How is moral responsibility for corporate actions determined? Well, some say it is the individuals who perform the action, and some say it is the corporation itself. Okay, here's a case study for you, the slavery in the chocolate industry. What are some salient facts of the story presented in the CNN story? Well, 45% of chocolate we consume in the United States and in the rest of the world is made from cacao beans grown and harvested on the farms in Ivory Coast. Most of the chocolate we eat was grown and harvested by children who worked as slaves. The chocolate industry is $14 billion alone in the United States. US companies that use Ivory Coast chocolate, Hershey's Food Corp, Mars Inc., Nestle USA, and Kraft Foods. The children are between the ages 9 to 16. The minimum employment rate in Ivory Coast is 14. What is the ethical problem presented here for this CNN story? Well, the children are treated inhumanely. They are abused. The children are not allowed to leave. The living conditions are inhumane. The US chocolate makers knew about the slavery in Ivory Coast, and it was not until the complicity came to the light that members of the Chocolate Manufacturers Association and the World Cacao Foundation took action to help eliminate child slavery in the production of chocolate. So, how did lawmakers exert pressure on US chocolate makers to stop complicity in child slavery? Well, slave-free labeling bill, the threat of a new bill that would prohibit the import of cacao produced by slave labor. What was the result of the proposed legislation? Well, members of the Chocolate Manufacturers Association and the World Cacao Foundation, caught in the spotlight of media attention, announced on October 1st, 2001, that they intended to put in place a system that would eliminate the worst forms of child labor, including slavery. CMA, WCF, and a major US chocolate company signed an agreement to establish a system of certification that would verify and certify that cacao beans they were used did not produce the use of child slaves. So far from achieving goals, what is the situation? There was no certification system as of 2008. Some progress made by 2010, but companies failed to meet their new deadline. So there's mixed responses here. What are some chocolate companies doing independently of formal actions to eliminate reduction of child labor slavery in production of cacao beans? Well, Hershey's announced that by 2020, its entire cacao supply would come from certified farms, and in 2014 reported that 18% of the cacao supply was certified by the Rainforest Alliance or other NGOs. Nestle announced that by 2014, the cacao used its Kit Kat candy would be certified by the UTZ. And Cadbury Kraft announced that, like Hershey's, it was working to have Rainforest Alliance by cacao certification. Now, what additional actions are taken? Well, former child slaves sued chocolate companies for knowingly supporting farmers who use child slaves. Now let's look at another case study. Look at Aaron Beam and the HEALTHSOUTH fraud. What ethical problem does the Aaron Beam and the Richard Scrushy case present? Well, we look at fraud, misrepresentation, as well as deception. Hiding a shortfall to appear profitable. We look at the aspect of falsification of financial report, deception accounting that violated accepted accounting standard, as well as misrepresentation to shareholders. And now for the investigation and outcome, how did they both respond to the case outcome differ? Well, Beam, who now owns a lawn-mowing business, says he finally can live with a clear conscience. Scrushy presents himself as a successful businessman and an inspirational speaker. This is all listed here for you. You can take your time to pause and read through. A quick summary for you in this portion is we covered what is business ethics. We covered how's relativism and objection to studying business ethics. There are no objective moral truths. There's no standard by which we judge outside of one's own society. We looked at what is moral reasoning, what are the key requirements of ethical businesses, and we looked at the difference between reasoning of injury and moral standards. Now let's jump into the next aspect of our lecture. Let's look at ethical principles in business. By the end of this section, you should be able to examine the foundations of moral decision-making in business, detail the concept of utilitarianism and how it is applied to business decisions, to examine a rights-based approach to business ethics, to explain justice and fairness as key ethical principles, to analyze an ethics of care and applied to business decisions and practices, to evaluate an approach to business ethics that combines four main moral standards: to relate virtue ethics to moral decision making in business, and to differentiate conscious, unconscious, and conscious moral decision making processes and implications. So, what is the purpose of this particular portion of our information? To explain the most important approaches are making moral judgments as they are carried out in business world, as well as the form of basis of ethical principles in business. Now, the approaches of moral decision making. How will approaches to moral decision making be discussed and analyzed? Well, we're going to identify the strengths and weaknesses of each approach and explain how using moral decision making can clarify the ethical issues that confront us in business. To begin by looking at how one company, Onoco, dealt with a series of moral decisions that it had to make. We look at the Unoco and Burma. How were the decision-making issues involving Unoco's Yadana gas field project in Burma? Well, there was an assessment of benefits to the region and the company, the existence of a military dictatorship in Burma, the existence of a decision to go forward with the project despite the risk. We look at human rights issues in Burma. We look at the critics' claim that the Unoco's supported an unjust military regime which brutally violated Burmese citizen rights, and the central ethical standards involved in thinking about rights and justice. So we look at rights, justice, utilitarianism, caring, and individual virtues and vices as well. So let's talk about utilitarianism. What is it? The approach to which Unoco's managers appealed. The view that actions and policies are evaluated by the benefits and costs produced by society. Then we look at utilitarian in the Ford Motor Company Pinto. Why was Pinto a rush project? Ford was losing market share to Japanese car companies, which were producing compact, fuel-efficient cars. The gas shortage put more pressure on Ford to come up with a competitive vehicle. What ethical errors did Ford make? So although the gas tank produced met legal and government standards at the time, its local made it susceptible to explosion if there was a collision. Ford decided to take the risk that this sort of collision would not happen or would be infrequent. So how did Ford use a utilitarian decision-making model? Well, the design met all the legal and government standards then in effect, and at the time, government and regulations required that the gas tank only remain intact in a rear-end collision of less than 20 miles per hour. Ford managers knew that the car was comparable in safety to several of small cars other companies were making, and they quickly put it on the market. So the design met all of the legal and government standards then in effect. At the time, government regulations required that a gas tank only remain intact in a rear-end collision of less than 20 miles per hour. According to the internal cost-benefit study, Ford conducted modifying that the Pinto would be more costly to the customers and then leaving its design unchanged. The study stated that approximately 12.5 million of the autos would eventually be built, modifying the gas tank of each car by surrounding it with a rubber bladder to contain any gasoline leaks, it said, and it would cost about $11 a unit. So we look at traditional utilitarianism. Who are German Betham and J.S. Mill? Betham and Mill are generally considered the founders of traditional utilitarianism. What are some significant features of utilitarianism? Its attempt to provide an objective basis for making ethical judgments. Its attempt to provide ethical principles that serve as publicly acceptable basis for determining the best social policies, as well as ethically best courses of action. And we look at the principle, it's based on objectivity and ascertainable beneficial and harmful consequences of action as well. So what is a utilitarian ethical principle? The ethical question is that one that had the most beneficial consequences or that at least minimize that harmful consequence. Mill, actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness as well. So to what does the term utility refer? The result of combining the beneficial and costly consequence of an action. How does Velasquez summarize the utilitarian decision-making process? We talk about an action is right for an ethical point of view if and only if the net sum of utilities produced by the action is greater than the net sum of utilities produced by any other action to the agent could it have performed its place. What are some mistakes in thinking about utilitarianism? Well, the right action is one whose beliefs outweigh the costs. The utility produced is one agent performing an action, and the consideration only of direct and immediate consequences. Now, what are the real world application of utilitarian decision making? Well, Lawrence Summers, Barack Obama's dictator of National Economic Council and the chief economics of World Bank, wrote a 1991 memo arguing that the waste from rich countries should be sent to poor countries. He provided four arguments, the claims of each being utilitarian. Now, the advantages of utilitarianism. What are some advantages? Well, it advocates policies that provide the greatest benefit. It impartially considered everyone's interests, and it explains why some activities are right or wrong. What is some connection between utilitarianism and economics? Economics applied cost benefit analysis, which is a utilitarian application. What are some of the utilitarian measurement problems? Well, utility is subjective and comparisons are difficult. Some benefits and costs seem impossible to measure. We look at benefits and costs as unclear, and it assumes that all goods are commensurable. Look at the measurement objections as well. Utilitarian uses estimates, not absolutes. It appeals to intrinsic and instrumental goods. It distinguishes between wants and needs, and it's amenable to quantification by monetary value as well. Let's talk about problems of rights and justice. What are some utilitarian problems associated with the rights and justice? Well, it doesn't take into account how evenly utility is distributed among members of society. It does not take into account the negative impact on the rights of those negative impacts of calculus as well. So how does utilitarian respond to criticism about the failure to protect rights and promote justice? Well, there's an alternative to traditional utilitarianism in the Rule Utilitarianism Act that it limits the utilitarian analysis to moral rules. What are two parts of the rule utilitarianism? Well, an action is right from an ethical point of view if and only if the action would be required by a correct moral rule. A moral rule is correct if and only if the total utility produced, if everyone were to focus the rule in a greater than total utility produced, if everyone were to follow some alternative rule. What is criticism of rule utilitarianism? Well, it is simple traditional utilitarianism disguised. If a rule allows people to make an exception, whenever an exception will maximize utility, then it will produce more utility than a rule that would allow no exceptions. How does the Unico Burma case provide an opportunity to study a rights-based approach to business ethics? Well, Unico offered a utilitarian defense of their decision. A right-based approach allows us to see the problems with the utilitarian approach. Unico critics argued it supports Burma's military regime violation of citizen rights to participate in political life of their nation, that their rights to speak freely and to come and go as they want, and their right to unionize and associate with one another. We also look at the Walt Disney Company stockholders taking into response the findings of the company was violating human rights through their factory suppliers in China. So it urged that company to adopt 11 widely acceptable principles of human and labor rights. What is the concept of a right? It's largely defined into terms of duties entailed by it. A right involves liberty, often the governmental interference. A right can involve a claim that someone to do something of a right holder. In this particular aspect, we talk about a person having a right when the person is entitled to act in a certain way and to have others act in a certain way toward them as well. Rights are moral or legal, inherent or conventional. We look at the essential features of a right: the absence of prohibitions, person is authorized, existence of prohibitions. A violated right does not always entail a harm. Moral rights are correlated with duties and provide a basis of justifying actions as well. And what are the essential differences between the conception of moral rights and utilitarianism? Well, rights are focused on the individual, and rights limit the validity of utilitarian appeals to social benefits as well. Now let's talk about what is the relation between Kant's categorical imperative and rights. We look at the CI requirement that people be treated equally. And this requirement allows people to claim equal treatment as a right. What is maxim? It's a personal rule for acting. How does maxim work in the formula of the CI? Well, we look at for a maxim to be a moral duty, one can be able to universalize it without contradiction in thought or will. Everyone must be able to act on that maxim, at least in that principle, and the maxim holder must be willing of his or her maximum to be applied to him or herself as well. What is the connection between rights and the second formulation of the CI? It commands respect for each person's freedom and rationality. It commands consent from free and rational beings. It commands that we contribute to each person's ability to pursue their freely and rationally chosen ends. And what are some rights based on Kant's CI? The right to have basic needs met, the right to be free from interference, as well as contractual rights. What are some problems with Kant's theoretical framework? It's not necessarily entirely clear. It's not to clarify the limits of the rights, and it does sometimes be proven by counterexamples as well. Now let's talk about Nozick and the libertarian objections. We look at Nozick's libertarian claims that the only moral right is a negative right to freedom. Consequently, restrictions on freedom are unjustifiable except for to prevent greater restrictions to freedom. We look at the right to freedom by crying a private property, the freedom of contract, free market, and the elimination of taxes to pay for social welfare programs. Freedoms are reciprocally restricted, so Nozick's claim that restrictions on freedom are unjust implies that freedom itself is unjustified. Now, taking it a step further, let's talk about how Unicles promotes injustice. Critics argued that their decision allowed the Burmese government to enrich itself on expenses of its citizens. In the aspect of how is it unjust understood in terms of wages in the fast food industry, if an employee cannot make a living wage, critics argued that the company that pays those wages commits an unjust. So how do disputes in business often resolve around justice and fairness? The examples of unjust or unfair treatment includes discrimination, favoritism, and unfair workloads. What form of justice are typically deployed in response to injustice? We look at distributive justice, retributive justice, as well as compensatory justice. Now, here we have the distributive justice taking a step further. We look at the principles aspect of it. Individuals who are similar in all respects relevant to the kind of treatment in question should be given similar benefits and burdens, even if they're dissimilar in other irrelevant respects. Individuals who are dissimilar in relevant respects ought to be treated dissimilarly in proportion of their dissimilarity. We look at the major conceptual element of distribution justice at equality or egalitarianism. We look at the capitalist justice as the aspect of what justice based on contribution. What is it in aspect of needs and abilities? Socialism. What is justice as freedom? Libertarianism. And what are critiques of libertarianism? It enshrines one value of expense of others, and it promotes unjust treatment of disadvantage. So what are the two principles of Rawls, justice or fairness? Well, each person has equal right to the most extensive basic liberties, compatible with similar liberties for all. So we look at the greatest benefit of least advantaged persons and attach to the offices and positions under each one. And we have different examples for the Rawls version of the egalitarian justice, but we won't get into it too much. You can take a look at it there. Here's a summary of principles of the distributive justice. It's all listed out for you. You can pause the video to look through. Now, for the retributive justice, what is it? It is the justice of blaming or punishing wrongdoers. What is compensatory justice? It is the justice by which a wrong person is restored to his or her initial condition. So when should someone be compensated? Well, the action that is inflicted, the injury was wrong or neglected, and the person's action was the actual cause of injury. So the person who inflicted the injury did so voluntarily. Now, an ethic of care. How does an ethic of care apply for business and decisions? We look at practices of the moral task is not to follow universal and impartial moral principles, but instead to attend and respond to the goods of principal or particular individuals with whom are in valuable and close relationship. We look at the Madden Mills Company as an example of care ethics and work. For Madden Mills Company, what happened in December 1995 in the Madden Mills textile factory and what happened to its backstory. A fire broke out, and Madden Mills, found in 1906, was one of the last remaining textile factories still operating in New England. After the fire, people predicted that Madden Mills owner Aaron Frunstein would collect more than $100 million in insurance, close the factory, and relocate to another country where the manufacturing was cheaper. The owner ended up paying employees while the factory was still being rebuilt. Now, criticisms of an ethic of care. What are some criticisms of ethics of care? It reflects unjust favoritism, and it depends on, it can lead to burnout as well. Looking at integrating utility, rights, justice, and caring, We look at what are the distinctive standards of utility, rights, justice, and care. Well, the analysis of cost benefits of using resources, how individuals should be treated, how burdens and benefits should be distributed, and for what we owe those special relationships as well. So, how can the combination of four moral models provide blueprints for our behavior? Our actions should maximize benefit and minimize harms, and our actions should be consistent with the moral rights of effective persons. Our actions should lead to just distribution of benefits and burdens, as well as to exhibit appropriate care. Here is the process of making a moral judgment. You can pause the video if you choose to list it there for you, but you'll see moral standards, factual information, and moral judgment. Now, the second step of how do moral standards relate to each other? Well, moral judgment should be based on maximizing the action's net utility, respecting moral rights, ensuring just distribution of benefits and burdens, as well as caring for those in concrete relations to us. And now, an alternative to moral principles, we look at virtue ethics. What is virtue ethics? How does the QS CEO exhibit vices? We look at greed by committing $3 billion in fraud, promoting a culture of fear instead of flourishing. What does the Joe Nashio Quest case study show us about the virtue of ethics? Well, character is morally important, not only about our actions. What is a moral virtue? An adequate disposition that is valued as part of a character of a morally good human being and that is exhibited in the person's habitual behavior. So we look at Aristotle's golden mean. It's a responsible mean between the extremes of excess and deficit. Here is a moral virtues and vices according to Aristotle list for you. I won't go through it for you, but you can pause to watch and read through. Now, virtue ethics, taking it a step further, we look at the aspect of rightness or wrongness of an action in relation to the agent's virtues and vices. We look at the aspect of inconsistency within psychology, which showed in Milgram's and Princeton studies that behavior is determined by the external situation and not moral character. And we also look at the aspect of rights theory, just theories, care theories, and the character is emphasized over action as well. Now, unconscious and conscious moral decisions, we know that it influences our daily basis. We know that there's an X system and C system process in this particular form in which the terms of unconscious and conscious moral decision-making play a process. And the legitimacy of unconscious moral decision-making plays a role in the casuistry as an unconscious moral decision-making process. So a prime example of cultural influence and intuition is that hardwired institutions seem to be including the following. Incest is wrong. Harming by action is worse than harming by omission. Harming as a means but to a goal is worse than harming as a foreseen side effect. Harming by physical contact is worse than harming without physical contact. Here's another case study for you, the Trados Bank and Roach's drug trails in China. It brought about different aspects in 2010 to remove itself in this investment portfolio because of the results of his clinical trials. Transplant organs in China were failing and falling short of the bank's investment criteria selection. So we look at the decision-making process. We look at promoting sustainable development, respecting and obeying the law, respecting human rights, respecting the environment, being accountable, and continuously improving as well. So what was Rochi's response? Well, it was apparent already concerned at the use of organs for non or involuntary patients. It also claimed, however, that it could not market a drug in China if the company did not test it here. So he used the utilitarian decision-making model. And then we looked at the different aspects here. It's listed. You can take your time to read through the case study to make a more connection between the vulnerability aspect and how participants may not be receiving existing treatments due to the research at hand. Okay, our final section of business ethics, the business system, government, markets, and international trade. By the end of this section, you should be able to explain the impact of globalization in the business system, analyze John Locke's theory of natural rights as it relates to free market, access key arguments associated with Adam Smith's utilitarian view of free market, analyze comparative advantage as a foundation for free trade among nations, interpret Marxist views on the impact on workers of free trade and free market, and explain the mixed economy and redefinitions of property that affect business system. So what constitutes the business system? Government, markets, international trade. Where does business happen? In markets, buying raw materials, supplies, and machinery in the industry, markets, works and labor, selling products and retailers in wholesale markets, and consumers in retail markets as well. What is the WTO, or the World Trade Organization? It is an international institution made up of signatory nations that agrees with governments and other organizations on free trade rules. We look at theorists debate the function of a business system, whether it's utilitarianism or socialism. Theorists debate the benefits of globalization, whether nations should trade freely or be subject to restrictions as well. We then also look at the economic system, the system used to provide goods and services. Two basic tasks are producing and distributing goods and services, as well as social devices, traditions, commands, and markets as well. We then jump into the aspect of market theory and market practice. We talk about swing line manufactured samples and related products, Abbott Labs, the pharmaceutical company, and what ethical issues arise as a result of these companies' business practices. We then talk about John Locke's aspects, the natural rights and free market economy, freedom to exchange goods and services, and the freedom to own property for government interference. Interpreting John Locke, Locke and the free market, the assumptions of failures he went through, and some criticisms of his theory. Did they argue about free market? No, but his theory had been applied in many different economical aspects, and there was different criticism of the Lockean ways. The four main criticisms being the assumption that individuals had natural rights Locke claimed they had, the assumption that negative rights had precedence over positive rights, the failure to acknowledge the adherence of Lockean rights can lead to injustice, and the conflict between Locke's individualist assumptions and the demands of caring. Here is a distribution of income and wealth among American households. Again, for this chart, you can pause along with the next figure being the rising U.S. inequality since 1973 as measured by the Gini Index. Here we have the figure increasing household inequality from 1974 to 2013. And here we have the increasing household inequality from 1974 to 2013. Now, free market and utility, Adam Smith, his argument for free market was that free market will generate more benefits than would be case if the government commanded the market. This is a utilitarian position, and private individuals seeking their own ends in the free market would actually benefit from the society. What was his theory called? It was free market competition as an invisible hand. Supply and demand created the conditions that benefit society, and resources are efficiently allocated according to supply and demand, which promotes social utility. So in Smith's view, what role should the government play in the free market? None, he said. He said that the government should not interfere with the free market since it's government's job to provide for societal welfare, and free market produces the most adequate amount of societal good. The government should not intervene. How did Mrs. and Hayek interpret Adam Smith? Well, they argued that there is a free market along with private ownership. It only means to efficiently allocate resources. No individual government can be efficient. The criticism with his output was that Smith makes several erroneous or at least problematic assumptions. The supply and demand will force prices down. He did not envision monopolies. Manufacturers will try to keep costs down since they pay for resources used to create it. Not all manufacturers pay for all resources, and you want to consider the environmental resources as well. And that profit is not universal motive. Then he talks about social Darwinism, that how do Spencer derive social application from Darwin's theory of adaptation? Well, Darwin's theory focuses on the biological change as a result of competition, adaptation, and mutilation. So Spencer argues that the free competition is allowed for only the fittest of businesses to survive. Now, what are some criticisms of Spencer's view? The skills and traits required to survive in a business are not analogous to those that allow individuals and species to survive in nature. So he admits to that naturalistic fallacy which occurs when we interfere a qualitative status from the way nature works. Nature is a way, therefore there is a good. How can Smith's utilitarianism argue free trade among nations? The same principles apply. Supply and demand leads to improved social conditions. And we talk about how the country has absolute advantage over other countries. So when it can produce a good more cheaply than other countries, and countries should specialize according to which they can. We look at labor, work skills, climate, technology, equipment, land, and natural resources as cheaper forms of goods. Here is an absolute advantage ratio listed out for you. You can pause the video. England and Portugal produce the same qualities of wine and cloth, but England uses 120 and 100 workers respectively, while Portugal uses 80, 90 respectively. Here we have the production without trade. So if both England and Portugal decide not to specialize, then given England's 220 total workers and Portugal's 170 total workers, the output of wine and cloth is 200 barrels and 200 rolls respectively for each country. Now, the specialization ratio being that Portugal has a comparative advantage over England in the production of wine, while England has the advantage of production of cloth. The comparative advantage means that each is more efficient than the other of making one product. Now, the comparative advantage ratio, we look at insight that if it were specialized, it could make more efficiently than others would benefit. Each would trade the other to make it much more efficient. We look at David Ricardo, he compared advantages of globalization. He argued has become influentially increasing globalization. And a criticism of him is that a significant aspect that does not hold up in practice. Now, Karl Marx and justice. Marx's fundamental critique of private property and free markets is that inequality is created. We look at alienation, estrangement from self and one's own work. The historical materialism, we look at market structures, the forces of production, the relations of production and social classes. And we look at social superstructures, the political and social institutions' influence on history and historical materialism as well. We also look at the emergencism of workers. We look at workers live great, get worse, lives get much worse, not better under capitalism. Here's a private and productive property. We look at property type, Marx's view, and explanation. Marx's view is that a private property system is the basis of alienation. Private property is productive property, for instance, farms and factories or capital. Now, what are some criticism of his critique of capitalism? Principles of justice are difficult to define. Justice requires free markets, and private property and free markets are more important than equity as well. So free markets encourage community, not alienation. Invention of workers hasn't occurred. And our final aspects of it coming down to the mixed economy, new forms of property, and the end of Marxism. We look at what are the theories saying today about free markets and Marxism. Well, some argue that the collapse of some communist regimes showed that Marxism has failed. Some argue that the success of economies with strong government intervention show that the free market is not the only path to prosperity. So what is a mixed economy? Well, it's a combination of government regulated, partially free markets and limited property rights. And the market and private property system remain in place, but government policies remained deficits as well. We look at the intellectual property rights and copyrights and patents. We look at engineering aspects. Now, is it the end of Marxism? The evidence is that Marxism has ended. So some point to the collapse of the Soviet Union, in particular, the abandonment of an attempt to achieve pure communism. Many socialist countries have incorporated capitalist elements. So what evidence is that Marxism has not ended? Well, some point to the reforms that they're not eradicating Marxism, but instead they have attempted to combine the best features of capitalism and socialism. So some argue that a mixed economy is the best way to combine utilitarianism values of a free market with human rights, justice, and caring. Now, what are the main ethical concepts here that we look at? We look at utilitarianism and private property, and what are the ethical concepts that underline critiques of free trade? We look at justice, human rights, and alienation. And that is the end of our lecture.